Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I am your host, Steve Ward. On each episode of the High Strangeness Factor, while we explore all aspects of the paranormal and the unexplained, we put a special emphasis on the parallels and underlying patterns that lie beneath the surface of all of these mysteries. Tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different. And this is going to be the first of what we're going to call the High Strangeness Factor Roundtable. And I have two great guests to help me make this possible. And we're going to get right to it. Emily Mittermaier is a paranormal researcher, an avid traveler, and a sensitive who has been interested in the unexplained since she was 4 years old. You can hear an interview we did together about a month and a half ago on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Just scroll back through the past episodes of the High Strangeness Factor. Emily writes about her paranormal travels and experiences in her blog, atravelingspirit.com, atravelingspirit.com, and she is always interested in exploring new areas of high strangeness. She lives in Morgantown, West Virginia, and enjoys her close proximity to paranormal hotspots such as Point Pleasant, Flatwoods, Grafton, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and the Moundsville State Penitentiary, all in West Virginia, and also the infamous Chestnut Ridge area in Pennsylvania. Also, our other guest is no stranger to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, or for that matter, the High Strangeness Factor. Andy Mercer is a writer, researcher, and professional psychotherapist with over 30 years' experience investigating both the esoteric and the paranormal, primarily from a phenomenological perspective, examining phenomena as it is, rather than trying to impose any particular theory on said phenomena. Outside his professional publications in the field of psychotherapy, his occult works have focused on the runes, Runin, the wisdom of the runes, and the Enochian magical world of Dr. John Dee, Liber Coranzum, an Enochian grimoire. His most recent title to be released, The Wicked Shall Decay, is his first work for international renowned Three Hands Press. Andy is currently working on his next work for Three Hands Press, focusing on the dark side of the Kabbalah. Outside of his writing and professional work, Andy is the show producer for a number of show broadcasts on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, including this show. He is also the musician composing dark ambient music, some which is used as themes for network shows. Lastly, Andy is the co-organizer of the annual Nameless Art Occult Conference in the UK. And I am happy to say that both of you are good friends.
Thanks so much.
Welcome back, Emily and Andy, to the High Strangeness Factor.
It's good to be back here on the radio with you guys, definitely.
Well, that's good. And we'll see how this roundtable goes. And I think it's going to go well, and I'd like to do more in the future. So let's just get started. Emily, you've been on before, but just give us a little bit of background of how it is that I'm always interested in how people got into this strange field and what it was like growing up with other people that always thought this kind of thing was pretty strange.
Sure. So I guess you could say I got into the field when I was about 4 years old, unbeknownst to me, when I saw what I believe now to be the ghost of a young boy in my room in my childhood home in Indianapolis. And I just remember seeing him standing behind my rocking chair and wondering, like, what's this little boy doing here? I don't recognize him from the neighborhood, but wasn't scared, just kind of brushed it off and went to bed. And then ever since then, I've been experiencing energies of presences of usually people, or what we consider spirits, around me at all times. I've gotten involved in other aspects of the paranormal, such as cryptozoology, UFOs, all kinds of stuff. And really, I love it all. And I'm very fortunate to be able to travel a lot to various places and get to investigate and meet fine folks like yourselves.
Well, as everybody knows that listens listens to this broadcast or me anywhere, I'm always talking about John Keel, and I know that you have been interested in John Keel for a long time, and may hold the record of reading the Mothman prophecies for more than anyone. What was it how did you find John Keel and the Mothman phenomena? How did you first discover that?
On accident, driving to Charleston, West Virginia with a friend to visit another friend, and we happened to be passing through Point Pleasant on the way there, and we were in the car driving, and I was in the passenger seat and just kind of dozing off and almost awoke with a start, thinking, oh my gosh, what is happening? And I'm looking around, and it's as we were crossing the Memorial Silver Bridge from Ohio into Point Pleasant, which replaced the Silver Bridge, of course, that collapsed back in the 60s. That's associated with the Mothman phenomena. I was like, that's so weird. I feel such a pull to this area, and I wasn't sure why. And that's kind of what began my research into what Point Pleasant was, what had happened there over the years. And that's really what got me into the Mothman and the lore of that whole area, and how I came to meet you, Steve.
Well, it's been great because we have kind of a informal group we call the Mothman Irregulars, which just means a bunch of people that hang around the Point Pleasant, not necessarily just at the Mothman Festival, which is a great event that we've both been to, which is every third weekend in September, and is a really, really great event, which we've both become very involved in. Now, just one last thing. When you were going across the bridge, and what was it like when you got this jolt? I mean, it wasn't a jolt with the car. It was something like like a psychic blast or something.
Yeah.
What was happening there?
Yes, it almost felt like I was traveling through. The best way I can describe it is like going through a veil. Like on one side, everything's clear and normal, and then you just hit a certain point, you pass through, and everything the energy is different. Things almost kind of look different. Something just doesn't seem quite right. And that's how I felt. And that's why I was so intrigued. I was thinking, what on earth is happening around here? And I continue to feel that feeling every time.
Did you know anything about that area before that? Did you know anything about the Mothman?
Not really. I had seen the Mothman Prophecies movie back when it came out, but didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it at the time, right. Honestly.
Okay.
So the name Point Pleasant had sounded familiar, and I was like, oh yeah, Mothman. And then it was after that experience, though, that I really started to heavily research it. I read the book, of course, many times, and have been going back ever since.
Well, I think I envy that ability. As you know, that my psychic abilities sort of shunt trip when there's anything out there to be sensed, and I really have had virtually no experiences. But you, Andy, I remember you telling us at one time that you were sensitive as a child and would see things that other people would not.
Yes, it's one of those things that when I look back now, I can think perhaps I was more aware of things than I thought I was. I can remember being quite young, asking questions about places that we were visiting on holiday, and saying, "Who's that person in the room?" and being told there was no one else there. Kind of vague memories of things like that when I was much younger. But as I've told the story before on other shows, I'll just briefly tell you my first real experience that really sort of made me think, "Oh, there's something weird going on here." I was about 9-10 years old. Where I live here in the UK in Essex, there's a large fort nearby. It was built in the Napoleonic times in the 1700s, and then built up a bit more during the First World War and then in the Second World War. But by the sort of 70s, when I was a kid, it was derelict. It was pretty much closed off to the public. It was scaffolding and corrugated iron surrounding it to keep people out because parts of the site were unsafe. But unfortunately, there were lots of big gaps in the fencing, and it was quite easy to get inside if you wanted to. Now, it was a big fort. It had a large kind of sort of ground in the middle, if you like, which was obviously like a parade ground, etc. And often kids would get in there, myself and friends, go in and sort of play football, which is English soccer, as we call it, as you call it. We call it football because you play your feet, not your hands. So it's there's just a few of us together. My brother was there, and the other kids didn't really know them. We just sort of got together and had a game. And I always remember this, and even now, talking about it, getting on for 40 odd years later, I can close my eyes, even with my eyes open. I can still see what I saw that day. Simply just playing football to one side, the ball was nowhere near me. I was just looked up, and not more than about 10 feet away were two men walking past in what looked like a uniform. The thing is, I never really saw their faces. I kind of looked at sort of waist, chest height, if you like, and down, and just for a few seconds, and looked down again and looked back at the football, and kind of thought, what the hell was that? Looking back, and they're gone. But they were absolutely as clear as anything, but they weren't sort of misty or ghostly or anything. It was solid. Just two men walking past in a khaki, light brown kind of uniform. And one thing I did notice, which stuck in my mind at the time, was they were like a webbing, like a bandaging around the lower halves of the legs below the knees. And I now know that is a First World War army uniform rather than a Second World War, which fitted in with the time frame. I probably saw them for no more than 5-10 seconds at absolute most. I kind of looked at them, kind of aware it was a bit odd that they were there and they were dressed strangely, but didn't really think about too much of it until I looked back again. As I say, they were gone. There was no sign of them. There was no sound. There was no footsteps. It was on a kind of a stony, gravelly area, but there was no sound of footsteps, and there was nowhere they could have gone to. There was just a wall where they appeared to have wandered off to, and I thought, that's quite strange. Those things, it kind of registered as weird, but didn't really pay vast amount of attention to it. And I can remember coming out a bit later on with my brother and the other kids and going back to my parents, and my granny was with us then, and saying, I've just seen this strange men. And it was kind of, oh, yes, of course you have. And that was it. I wasn't taking it serious to that, but it absolutely fascinated me. And I wanted to discover more. And of course, back in those days, we're talking late 70s, there was no internet or anything like that. It was just the local library, and started reading about ghosts and the supernatural, and thought, yeah, pretty much must be what I saw were basically ghosts of these men. As I say, it wasn't until many years later I kind of realised exactly the time frame I've been viewing, say, First World War rather than Second or anything like that. But it was definitely one of those things. It's just stuck with me, and even now, just talking about it, I can picture them in my mind very clearly.
That was back in my, I was still in my very intense John Keel period. And of course, John Keel's the guy that really, when I read UFO's Operation Trojan Horse, kind of messed up my very comfortable paradigm, because I was very happy with UFOs coming from other planets and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Last time, Emily, you talked a lot of some about your travels and some of the things you experienced. And I actually looked at your blog, atravelingspirit.com, and it says in there that you've been all over the place, like places like Peru, Australia, and the faraway land of Arkansas.
Yes,
That's a joke.
The land of my people.
It might be far away for Andy, but not
it's a long way from me.
Quite so far for us. Yes, it's still far from us, but not that far. Tell us, I'm just curious about some of those, was that when you were a child, when you were traveling in some of those places, and maybe not connected with paranormal stuff, or is that, tell us about Peru and Australia.
Yeah, so Peru, I have actually been twice. The first time I went, I was a child. I was 8 years old, and it was to adopt my little sister.
Cool.
Yeah, I actually do remember the trip very well. But most recently, the second trip was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. We went back, my whole family went back, including my sister, where she was able to meet her biological mother and sister there. And then we did, a 10-day tour around the country. And so by then I was very well into the paranormal. And we did go to a couple places that had an energy to them, Machu Picchu being one,
okay.
For sure. And I always get, it's always tough for me when I go to places that are kind of out in the middle of nowhere, because I also sometimes just get a little nervous and a knot in my stomach when I am in the middle of nowhere, and it has nothing to do with the paranormal. It just has to do with there's no living creatures for miles. And, what if my car breaks down, or what if my phone dies? I'm going to die out here. So I do have a bit of a fear of that. So for Machu Picchu, definitely in the middle of nowhere. But I definitely felt an energy and a presence there that was pretty strong and remarkable. But again, there were lots of people, tourists around, so it was kind of hard for me to hone in. I really do need to have quiet and focus to be able to best, hone in on the energies that are in a place. But it was very cool to see, paranormal or not. It was absolutely stunning.
I was in Belize many years ago, not too long after it changed from British Honduras to Belize. And a friend of mine's uncle was the Roman Catholic bishop there, and we stayed in the presbytery. And I got to see places like Altun Ha, which I think was an Aztec ruin. And then we went across into Guatemala to see Tikal, which was pretty spectacular. Of course, I recognized Tikal as the rebel base years later in the original Star Wars film, but had no idea that was the rebel base. But as you know, it's too bad that you weren't there, because you could have talked about all the cosmic vibes that were being sent out that I was not picking up. Is there any other travels more recently that we haven't talked about before that you wanted to talk about?
I actually haven't gone anywhere much since we talked, or since I was on a couple months ago. I think really the only places I've gone are Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh.
Okay. It seems like there was, I don't remember what it was, but it seemed like there was something you left out that we didn't cover that time. I can't remember what it was, but maybe it'll come to you.
I can't remember.
I
went to Roswell. March.
Okay.
Got to see the International UFO Museum and be driving around the area where the crash happened. Of course, you can't go to the crash site because it's on private property, but it was really cool to be able to see that history and see the town of Roswell finally. and their UFO museum was outstanding. I thought it was fantastic. Highly recommend it.
Did you happen to go out to, now I have no idea of the geography there, but did you happen to go out to any of the areas that where the alleged crash took place?
No. So we tried to figure out kind of where that was. So we knew a direction, but since the crash site was private property, you can't actually go right out to it. Right. But we were driving, I forget where we were going from there. We might have been heading up to Cimarron, to the haunted St. James Hotel. And so the route we were taking would have gone by near where the crash site was. So we were nearby, but that was it. And again, in the middle of nowhere. So I had that feeling in my gut of, what if the car breaks down? What if there's serial killers out here?
But you weren't, serial killers you weren't getting visions of grays though, right?
I was not. I had kind of a weird feeling, but aside from the paranoia of being in the middle of nowhere. And so I feel like there was kind of something to it. And New Mexico, of course, there's vast spaces of emptiness where nobody is. So it's kind of an ideal place for, if aliens were circling around in their craft.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting what you're saying about the fact that there's a kind of a feel to the area, and I do wonder if it's not to do with what may or may not have happened in the 1940s, but because so many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have visited the area with that kind of mindset, that maybe they've left an impression themselves individually not very strong, but when you get tens, hundreds of thousands of people together, it's created a feeling in the atmosphere because of its history and notoriety. It makes you wonder if perhaps we're affecting the environment ourselves and then creating that kind of environment, if you like, that kind of atmosphere to the place. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does, and over a period of now decades, people have been pouring that energy into that area, and it may well be that nothing happened there. It might have been a balloon, but with all the strong, intense belief system via Carl Jung or the collective unconsciousness or whatever, that perhaps there's I remember years ago there was supposedly there's supposed to have been sightings of alien gray ghosts in the hospital near there, and because Some people believe that, well, they took the dying aliens to the hospital, and their ghosts still run around there. People talk about the elevators
No.
going up and down and see. Now, I can't remember the source, but I remember years ago there was a TV show, a pilot done. I forget the name of it, but it had Nick Redfern, Joshua Warren, Jim Mars, Heidi Hollis, a whole string of people. This goes way back, 10 or 15 years ago, I think. And so they did their pilot episode, and of course TV does all kinds of strange stuff. So they did it was supposed to be they were going to try and contact the dead alien greys. So they're probably all groaning inside like, okay, this is our pilot episode of this great TV show, right? Well, I guess now Joshua Warren is the first guy to blow the whistle on this, and I think Nick Redfern has verified it years ago. I'd love to talk to these guys about this, but they did a kind of a seance. I would call it a mock seance, and they're gonna, they're doing the deal where they're supposed to be contacting the dead greys, and one of the guys, I don't know who it was, passed out,
Mm.
and then on the high definition cameras, they got an image of something floating through the air that they described something like a segmented centipede or something like that. And
Grief.
it was kind of translucent, and it went by, and nobody had an explanation for it. So it doesn't make any sense from any perspective. But I heard Joshua Warren, they weren't supposed to, how you sign these non-disclosure agreements for TV shows. Well, Warren got, I guess, a little ticked off about it, and he blew the whistle. And unfortunately, it was never really shown on TV. I would love to see it, whatever it was, and make my own judgment. But anyway,
That kind of reminds you of something else, actually.
yes,
Are you
go ahead.
familiar with the Phillips experiment? Well, they
Yes.
tried to create a ghost, and then they seemed to actually get responses as if the ghost was there. And
In Toronto.
yeah, that's it. And you do wonder if this is not another example of that, this sort of strange imagery you're seeing, because there's that belief and intent and desire to experience something. Because I mean, that's the ultimate crossover, the ghost of an alien. It really is combining the two main areas into one. But you wonder if there's that kind of thing going on. It fascinates me. I mean, as you know, my training in psychotherapy now is in more Jungian based, and with the collective unconscious being a major part in my own work and the archetypes. So of course that level fascinates me as well, and for me that's a strong kind of leaning towards an explanation for a lot of this sort of phenomena. Again, as we've said before, it doesn't mean to say it's just imagination, nothing far from it, but not necessarily nuts and bolts either. But I mean, as we're just sort of talking about Roswell, what do you two think? What are your own sort of personal theories about what Roswell actually was?
Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Oh,
Hey, you first, so I can think about my answers. See that? I can do that sneaky stuff when I'm sort of the alleged host of the show.
I'll tell you what. Let me throw mine in first. If you both have a moment to
Okay.
think about it, might
right.
help. I've always been of the opinion that it was some kind of earthbound experimental craft that the NASA or the American military were working on at the time that crashed, and that the supposed aliens were possibly things like crash test dummies, if I can say the words, or possibly mammals like chimpanzees or apes that were then sort of strapped into this craft. And I've always thought myself, that's been my own personal belief, that it is something strange and weird, not just a weather balloon, but it is earthbound technology. That's my own opinion. It's my own theory on the matter. I mean, if I could be talking rubbish, but that, from what I've read and watched and sort of looked at, that to me makes the best sense, personally speaking.
I have gone, like the pendulum back and forth over the years. Back in my ET days, I was pretty sure it was a crashed saucer with alien bodies, but it was a lot of times it was confused with the alleged Aztec crash, which is supposed to have happened about the same time. And the Aztec crash is the one that was covered by what's called Behind the Flying Saucers by investigative reporter Frank Scully.
Oh yes, I know.
And that is pretty much revealed as I'm going to say it was pretty much revealed as a hoax. There was the scientist he labels as Mr. G in the book was actually a con man, I think. But nevertheless, there's other books out. It's like Andy and Emily. Some hoaxes just will not die. And I'm going to open up the door, possibly. Maybe it was something real, but I tend to think it wasn't. This is Aztec. And it just won't go away no matter what, information comes out to suggest that it's a hoax. But with Roswell, kind of the same thing. It could have been, it was some kind of an experiment, and They just wanted to keep it quiet, and they certainly didn't want to create any flying saucer hysteria. But over the years, it seems to me, and I'm not an expert on Roswell, that they have come up with different explanations over the years. I mean, official ones, almost like they're testing the limits of our belief. What will the populace buy this time? If we, some people said that the crash test dummy thing, that they weren't using crash test dummies at that point in time. I don't know if that's true or not. But so I tend to think Roswell was,
I mean,
as you do, Andy, nothing more than something very terrestrial.
given that time frame, it wouldn't surprise you at all if they weren't actually using primates, actual living primates in these craft. And I mean, you couldn't do that now. Hopefully, you wouldn't do that now. But it wouldn't surprise you in the 40s with the arms race and the threat of the Soviet Union and missile crisis, all that kind of stuff that was already under the surface, if you like, before even the end of the Second World War. That they would go to any lengths to make sure that we as in general the West had a superiority over the Russian Soviet bloc, if you like, technologically and militarily. So it wouldn't surprise you if they weren't using genuine living primates. Then, of course, may have been burnt in a fire, lost their hair through being burnt, and then would look quite pink, would look bald, alien-like, and with the right kind of size and proportions. But I mean, Emily, what's your thinking?
I'm with. Well, I agree with both of you, in Steve, in that I often go back and forth. It depends on what I'm reading about it at the time, right? Because I think all explanations could make sense or could be plausible. So there are definitely some days where I'm convinced it was an alien craft. There's other days where I'm thoroughly convinced that, yes, it was something terrestrial. It can be explained. And I think at this moment today, I think I'm of the opinion that what makes the most sense is that, yes, it was some sort of weird experimental something that was going on, but that was coming from us, from the Earth, whether it was the primates or I think it was Nick Redfern who wrote a book a couple years ago about this and said that there were Japanese craft that were being experimented with and being sent over, and they had put, I don't think it was children, it might have been people with special needs. And so they
yes,
may
I
have,
think that's what he suggested was special needs people.
Right. So they may have looked a little different, and then, they're coming from Japan. And so it might have been, misidentification on the part of the eyewitnesses. I hope that's not the explanation. That would be awful.
So there was literally using people for the experiments. Oh, that's awful.
Yeah. It was something about, I don't remember the full title, Bodies in the Desert or something like that. And it was one of the ones, he's always tapped into freedom of information, and he's always getting these, Nick Redfern, that is, these whistleblowers coming forth. And he's open. He said, look, he's getting this information and he's reporting it, but he can't always verify it, obviously. Because I think he came out with another book which he had another source about Roswell, and my memory's failing me on that. But I will admit that occasionally I will even pause and say, well, maybe Roswell was a crashed alien saucer. I mean, if only one of these crash saucers are true, and there are dozens of them, claims of them, then obviously that puts it in the realm of the physical. I've gotten to the point where Roswell bores me to death. I just can't. It's like there's so many claims and so many beliefs. I think I'd rather, I don't know, watch reruns of BJ and the Bear than read a book on Roswell. Okay, and I forgive all you people that love BJ and the Bear. Okay, but anyway. We started talking about this idea of, and of course I've dealt a lot with this with John Keel, Jacques Vallée, and many other researchers about this idea of human consciousness, maybe not necessarily creating all these things, but certainly interfacing with the paranormal to a large degree. And you've done a lot of thinking about the abduction experience, I know. But now, just before we get into that, I want to remember to do my station identification. I have to remind everybody at this point in the program that you are listening to the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Steve Ward, and with me today is two people on the High Strangeness Factor Roundtable, Emily Mittermaier and Andy Mercer. And Andy, so what I know you've done your degree is in psychology. What would be the proper way to put that?
Well, my first degree is actually in philosophy, but I particularly focused on the mind and consciousness and political philosophy.
Okay.
And now I have qualifications as a psychotherapist and sort of advanced. I'm also a qualified school teacher, but I don't do that anymore. It's what we did talk briefly about this before. I mean, you're saying about alien abduction. What I've become fascinated with, and was even before I was a therapist, and now I've encountered it firsthand by working with people who've had these kind of experiences that come under the bracket of sometimes called sleep paralysis or the old hag syndrome or hypnagogic dreaming. They're all kind of different terms for a very similar phenomena. I'll just briefly tell the story of the kind of things people experience during these episodes. They find themselves waking up in the middle of the night and have a feeling that they can't move, that somehow something is preventing them from moving. Often they find they're lying on their backs when they experience it, but not always, but quite often on their back. And they'll have a sense perhaps of something either in the room with them or even physically touching them or sitting on them or holding them down. Some people have reported the feeling of more than one presence in the room with them. But the fear and the panic that they experience being in what seems to be a familiar environment of their own bedroom and yet not being able to move and feeling that something's touching them or panicking with them or having any effect upon them, that I found absolutely fascinating. It was something I'd read about many years ago, and actually saw a TV program that talked about it a number of years ago and wondered what that was all about. It was often tied in with, as I said, the idea of alien abduction, that people would say they were being taken from their rooms at night by the little creatures or figures and being experimented upon, often in a rather unpleasant sexual nature, and being poked and examined and then finding themselves back in bed as if nothing had happened. Other people who experience these kind of strange phenomena were talking about seeing ghosts or monsters or demons even, or creatures, or what is called a succubi or incubi actually attacking or affecting them. And it was absolutely fascinating stuff, and I did wonder what on earth was going on. So I began to look into this rather strange phenomena. And as part of that research, which eventually turned into a paper I wrote for a psychology magazine some years ago, I started questioning people and asking people who'd had these kind of experiences, what it was they'd actually seen firsthand, what they had actually experienced themselves. It's never happened to me, but I've discovered a few people I know have had the experience. And a couple of things that really sort of struck me first of all was it's actually fairly common, but because most people have heard stories or think it's something frightening or scary, or people are going to think they're mad or insane, don't talk about it. But it was actually a surprising number of people had the experience. And that kind of research I put to one side when I was training to be a psychotherapist. And one of my earlier clients, and this guy actually knows I've mentioned him before, so I asked him permission to mention him, but not by name, but just mention his story in the paper I was writing. And he said, no problem at all, that's fine. He came to see me because he was having issues around sort of anxiety and worry. And I always ask various questions when someone first comes for help with therapy is, do you have any problems sleeping? And he said, yes, often I don't sleep very well. And, do you find yourself waking up in the night? And he said, yeah, often I find I wake up, I feel kind of stressed or panicked. But there was this one occasion, and then he started to tell me this rather fascinating story. Now, he had no interest in the paranormal, ghosts, UFOs, nothing. It was no interest in him at all. He was an accountant, self-employed accountant. Not to say that because he's an accountant he wouldn't be interested, but he was. He was just a kind of very sort of down-to-earth chap. And he said he was lying in bed in the middle of the night, and he woke up, and he suddenly had this feeling. He had his two young children, he had two young boys who were in the bedroom. In the middle of the night, he was like, why are you in here? And he went to try and speak to things. He knew they were at the end of the bed. He couldn't see them, and he couldn't move. And he was quite panicked by this. And he was trying to call out, saying, why are you here? Why, you go back to bed, boys. But he realised nothing was coming out of his mouth. His wife was laying beside him, he said, and I was really starting to get panicked. So I just couldn't move. It's like something was holding me down. And then I woke up, and it was the morning. So it was just really weird. I said to my wife at breakfast, didn't you hear me calling to you in the night? And she said, no, you didn't make a sound. When the boys were up, he asked them, and they said, no, we didn't leave our bedrooms all night. And he said it was just really weird. It was like they were definitely in the bedroom, and they definitely were doing something at the end of the bed. He said it was very strange. Now, I didn't mention at that point about this phenomenon at all. And I thought, well, this is interesting because he's clearly experiencing the very kind of thing that I've been reading about. But what I've been reading has been more linked to people with UFO type experiences or ghost experiences. And that was quite fascinating. Here's someone who had no interest in this field at all, but was now looking for what for him was just an ordinary down to earth explanation of my kids got out of bed and they shouldn't have done. So that was really fascinating. Let's start with back on this road of trying to explore this information further. Now, I'd actually spoken to a guy I had worked with previously some time ago, again, talking about this kind of UFO ghosty stuff. And he'd had a series of interesting experiences. He was a Scottish guy. He lived up in Scotland at the University of Glasgow, did his degree in art there. And he said, I was living in a one-bedroom flat, or rather a shared house. He was living in one of the rooms in the shared house. And he said, whenever I was really stressed or deadlines were coming up, I used to have this really weird experience. He said, I'd be laying in bed and there'd be this orange light outside. Now, he said, there's no street light outside my room. Definitely not. There's no light there. But there was like a strange light that was quite bright. And he said, I'd find I couldn't move. And it felt like someone was sitting on my chest. He said, a couple of times, I thought I heard someone breathing. And so it was really weird. Now, he wasn't, again, no interest in ghosts, supernatural. He thought it was a load of rubbish, all of it. He had no interest at all. And he said, I knew I was dreaming. But he said it was so real, it was frighteningly real, but I knew it was a dream. And he said it would happen whenever he was stressed or had deadlines to meet, he'd have this experience. And he said once the deadlines are passed, he said it didn't happen. Now, he said the interesting thing was he'd finished his first degree in art and qualified, got his degree, and he was doing his master's at Guildhall University in London. So he came down to the UK, of course, down to London, of course, and got a flat here. Again, shared house. Totally different kind of house, different layout, everything. But he said once the deadline started to get close, that bloody light came back again. He said it was outside the window again. Now, if you were into UFOs and abduction and that kind of stuff, you would undoubtedly think that's a UFO outside a window. There's aliens going to come and sort of drag me off or interfere with me. But he was adamant, no, I don't believe any of that kind of stuff. Although he said one time it did feel like I was kind of floating around the bedroom. So it was really freaky. And it was undoubtedly, he was having that very same experience, the hypnagogic dreaming and sleep paralysis. And it's just fascinating. I collected dozens of different stories from friends and friends of friends who, wanted to talk about this weird experience to someone who wasn't basically who had an understanding of psychology and wasn't going to take the mickey out of them. But it was absolutely fascinating. And a couple of things really began to strike me with the people I was talking to. Now, this is the fascinating thing for me was the people I spoke to who had any interest in the supernatural, ghosts, even horror films, those kind of things, for them it was supernatural. It was a ghost in the room. It was an old hag. It was a succubi, incubus. It was a demon that was sitting on them and interfering with them. Anyone who's interested in UFOs or sci-fi, even just like Star Trek or Star Wars, for them it was aliens. It was alien creatures in the bedroom. It was being taken off the spaceships and all that kind of stuff. So it seemed to be that their own mindset and interest, and of course the third category, people who are interested in neither, had no such experience. They just had a sense of kids being in the room or someone being there that shouldn't be there or odd feelings. So it seemed to be whatever your thinking was, whatever your idea or belief system was it influencing how you were experiencing this experience and phenomena. Now, of course, I wanted to take it a little bit deeper into the realms of psychology to understand, is there a psychological or physiological process behind this? And the answer is basically yes. A couple of things I'll just briefly mention just to give you an idea of the psychology and the physiology behind this experience. We have the hypnagogic side, which is the dreaming aspect. Now, usually when we fall asleep, we go from a light level of sleep, we drift off, and you probably all aware you find your mind wanders off and you start kind of vaguely dreaming a little bit, and then you might wake up a little bit and think, oh, I'm not quite asleep here. But then you do drift off into proper sleep and you go down into REM sleep, where you dream, you have your actual dreams. Now, we all dream every night. It's a feature of our psychology. Even if you don't remember your dreams, you will have dreamed. And what happens is the body naturally goes into a paralysis. The muscles stop working. The reason behind that psychologically is that it stops you from thrashing out and throwing your arms and legs about, so you don't injure yourself, or of course, if you're married, injure the person next to you. That's the effect it has upon you. That's normal. But the strange thing that happens is that when you're having this kind of experience, you're not going through the normal sleep pattern. You're not going into the normal deep sleep and dream sleep. You're coming out of it into a much lighter state of sleep, but you're still dreaming. So your body is still in paralysis, as it should be, but you're almost half awake. Therefore, you're aware of your environment, your immediate environment around you. It does mingle in with the dream stuff, so you get strange imagery like the light outside the window that doesn't fit with your normal world. And if your mind is dreaming a little further, then you can see sort of strange buildings or weird environments you might find yourself in. That's the hypnagogic part. It's a phenomenon that occurs often to do with stress and sleep disturbance, but it can happen if you're just perfectly fine and having no problems at all. So the sleep paralysis side, as I say, that's the physical phenomena where your body is in a paralysis. So naturally you'll feel heavier because your limbs aren't moving. And the interesting thing was, one study I read about sleep paralysis is that when you begin to wake up, the more sensitive parts of the body are the first parts to start actually having sensations again, including, of course, genitalia, which is often this idea of this interference in the old probe up the backside, that kind of thing that people talk about. So that area is often the first to become sensitive again. So your body's not working, but this part is more aware of feeling. So it kind of will feel strange to you. I mean, that was the kind of thing I began to realize, that there was definitely a correlation between a person's belief system and ideas and the kind of experience they had. Now, it's not universal. Obviously, some people have different kinds of experiences, but that was a definite trend I noticed with quite a large number of people I spoke to about this phenomena. Now, again, I'm not saying that abductions don't happen. I don't think they do, but I'm not saying absolutely they don't, so I don't know everybody's experiences, of course. Similarly, I'm interested in the supernatural, and it could be that maybe there is a ghost in the house that comes and sits on your chest. But the fact that there's been this idea of incubi and succubi around for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years of reports of similar kind of creatures, it's our attempt to explain something that at the time we would have no way of understanding this kind of strange phenomena. And I found again the program I watched years ago that had a chap who had repeatedly experienced these kind of strange phenomena, and they had him strapped up to a sleep machine and monitoring his brainwave patterns, and he was having episodes, and he was telling the researchers what he was experiencing, what he was seeing, and they said the one thing that struck them was that according to his brainwave patterning, he was asleep, yet they say his eyes would be wide open and he'd look around the room, but the brainwave patterning said no, he's still asleep. So the body was responding in a very strange way. Now, again, it doesn't mean to say everyone has that same experience, but for him, body was responding as if he was awake. Eyes were open and moving his head about. He said he couldn't move his body, but he could look around. But the brainwave patterning said, no, you're still asleep. So that's a kind of potted history of my research into this topic.
Just one thing I wanted to translate for some people that you said to take the mickey out of somebody. Well, when I was in Scotland many years ago, somebody used that expression, and I said, what does that mean? It simply means to put somebody on. Yeah. So now everybody all over the U.S. and Midwest knows what Andy said. Okay, we're good.
Perfect.
But Emily, have you ever had the some kind of a sleep paralysis experience, or wake up and you're paralyzed in bed?
I have not, but two things I was thinking of as Andy was talking about that was something I hear often from paranormal folks. So this is not just your run-of-the-mill people. I often hear it, on paranormal shows I listen to, or in articles or books that I'm reading, is that when people experience sleep paralysis, or they wake up and there's someone in their room or sitting on them, or there's a light outside that could be a UFO, a lot of times I hear that it happens at the same time every time it happens, not just for the individual person, but I have heard so many accounts where everyone says 3 a.m. this is what happens. And it's one of those different types of experiences, Andy, that you were describing. And I don't know if you have heard that or seen that pattern in these types of experiences, but that's something that I've heard. And just in the past couple of weeks, I've heard it on several different shows where people are talking about these experiences, and they always happen at 3 a.m. And then now when I wake up at 3 a.m., I freak out. I'm like, oh no, what's happening?
Well, I found the perfect cure for that. I don't go to bed till about 3 a.m., so I don't have that problem.
There you go.
But yeah, it was predominantly the sort of 3, 4 a.m., around that, what they call the death hour as well, which is apparently the time most people die. So they were having this kind of phenomenal experiences. But I'll tell you just quickly one little side story that was absolutely fascinating with a friend of mine, actually, a friend of my wife's actually experienced. I was saying about the UFO interest, you'd see aliens or ghost influence, you'd see ghosts. She was fascinated by Egypt. She absolutely loved Egypt. She'd been there on holiday a few times. She had Egypt statues around her house and sort of pictures on the wall. And for her, the visitation she used to have, it was a big cat, but it was Egyptian. It had an Egyptian headdress on. He used to come and sit on her chest and purr in her ear, and she loved it. She had no problem with that at all. But that's exactly what she experienced. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, couldn't move, and then the cat, this huge cat, would come in and sit on her chest. She didn't have it. She has a pet cat. It wasn't the actual cat at all. It was much, much bigger, and it was like an Egyptian cat, and she loved it. But it was like, that's typical of our friend. She's a little strange, but yeah. But yeah,
now that would be okay with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Showed up at 3 a.m.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the other thing that did strike me, that it is the phenomena that people see. You know, why don't you see a unicorn or, you know, a fairy or something you see as harmless? I think it's all part of the whole sense of panic and fear and worry. Because the one thing I know with the human mind is that if you have a fear that's underlying, then you'll find something to be afraid of. You know, in sort of realms of psychotherapy, I deal a lot with people with anxiety, and they have fears about all sorts of things that most of us think, oh, that's not a problem. But for them, it's a problem because there's an underlying sense of fear and anxiety anyway, and it will latch on to whatever problem that might be there. So people will tend to see unpleasant phenomena because it was fitted in with this kind of whole sense of being afraid and being trapped. And, you know, we all have memories of nightmares, etc., that we've had. And it's kind of almost replaying some of those. But yeah, I mean, it usually is around that sort of 2, 3, 4 a.m. kind of time frame that people experience these sorts of things, literally in the dead of night where you are. And this is the other thing that was interesting in my research, was you're in the middle between two sleep cycles. Now, it's slightly controversial, the notion of sleep cycles. Not everyone that adheres to it, but I think there's a lot of evidence to say that we do go through 2 complete cycles of sleep, and each sleep cycle lasts between 3 to 4 hours. So if you go to bed sort of normal kind of 11 o'clock at night, like 10:30, 11ish, you go through a full cycle and you kind of begin to wake up a little bit, but then you'll stay asleep if it's normal. But if you have particularly like anxiety, for example, you will tend to wake up after 3 or 4 hours because your brain's got to that point of being slightly awake and you're awake again. And it tended to be after 3 or 4 hours of sleep that people had this kind of experience. So again, that kind of ties in with it. Because the kind of thing that struck me again was, you know, if these things are external phenomena, why do they only happen in the middle of the night? Why not sort of 7 o'clock in the evening, or, you know, 6:30 in the morning when the sun's up, you're about to go to work? It's always that kind of dead hours that these kind of things were always happening to people. So that was always struck me as being an interesting part of the phenomenon as well.
Of course, there are some that take place during other parts of the day. I think that there's more than one answer. I mean, John Keel talked about literal transmogrifications of energy into sort of temporal physical constructs, I guess you could say. Jacques Vallée talked about sort of a control system. It's kind of vague as to whether or not how physical it was. And of course, there's the collective unconscious aspect, and even possibly ETs. I think we're dealing with more than one thing. Although your points are well taken. One thing I wanted to mention. When I interviewed Missy Lamontagne, who had a really bizarre abduction experience, and she's in the archives of the High Strangeness Factor. She and her husband saw a black triangle go overhead, and then they lost about a half hour's time. Sometime later, under regressive hypnosis, the alleged event was revealed with grays and just a really bizarre series of events. Too much to go into now. She's very rational about it. She's very careful about taking it at face value because she doesn't remember this consciously. But something really interesting happened. She finally made a breakthrough with the hypnotherapist, which took a while. She picks up the phone and calls the original group, the man that runs the group that investigated her abduction experience. And he said, "Wait, I have something to tell you before you tell me." And he said, the night before, he had an out-of-body experience where he went to their room, she and her husband's room. He could describe it. He could describe what they were wearing, and there's no way he could have known. And standing next to the bed in his dream, out-of-body experience or whatever, were the two the grays, these pale gray entities that she described in her experience. And they were basically communicating to him, yes, we are examining these people, and that's what's going on. So that still could be in the realm of consciousness, but it was just fascinating that she got this information from him before she told him anything about her experience. So it's a very complex event. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I think this ties a little bit in with what you're talking about, Andy. If you go back Anne Jeffreys in the 1600s. She had these very detailed experiences with the fairies, but she didn't travel anywhere. She was in a trance in her room,
Yes.
and she would describe these events. In the 1950s, 60s, Orfeo Angelucci, famous contactee, he would go into trances on the couch and contact the beautiful space brothers from Venus or whatever. It was a case in northern Wales in 78, Gaynor Sutherland, the Sutherland family.
Oh, yes.
The young lady was having these. Remember that? That's
I know
fascinating.
the story very well indeed, of course. It's all the Green Stone and Andy Collins and Graham
Yes,
Phillips.
yes, it leads into that, which I didn't realize at first. The original case was investigated by Jenny Randalls, and the point is that in one of the kids were having seemingly physical experiences in the daytime and so forth with these beings. But one time, Gaynor was had this experience, sort of an out of body kind of experience, so almost where she's traveling down a tunnel, she contacts the same alien she's been talking to, but her mother actually goes upstairs during that period of time and sees her laying in bed, rigid with her arms by her side. She wasn't going anywhere. It was sort of like Anne Jeffreys or Orfeo Angelucci, but another variation of it. So there's definitely a very non-physical aspect to all this.
Absolutely. I mean, as I say, my research is more specifically to do with that particular kind of experience, the hypnagogic dream and sleep paralysis, the early hours of the morning phenomenon. I mean, obviously there are various stories and cases of people having what seem like very real experiences in broad daylight, out and about, or in their homes. This my research is more specifically in that area, and as we've talked before, it's the division between subject and object, the physical reality or the internal subjective reality, that's, it's old hat now. We need to develop a different way of seeing these things, that these phenomena are neither inside ourselves nor just out there in the world. They're between the two. As we've talked previously, these things behave in such ways that just defy physics, the basic fundamental laws of reality. It's not that they bend them, they just don't take notice of those rules. So something weird's going on there, certainly.
And they also defy logic. I mean, look at the classic Joe Symington case in Eagle River, Wisconsin. That's the one where in *61 the craft lands. He meets the entities that he says looks like Italian. They look like Italians. They're cooking pancakes on a flameless grill. They need water. I don't know why they would need water for experimentation, or I'd hate to think what their plumbing system's like aboard this craft. But they give him a bowl to get water from his well. And there's so many things that connect us to the fairies, and we'll have to talk about that sometime because it's a fascinating case. But if you look at it at face value, number one, in the '61, people think aliens. 100 or 200 years before, they'd say, well, it must be the fairies.
Absolutely.
Because even though they arrived in this strange-looking chariot. But from any perspective, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But to all accounts, Dr. Hynek, the famous Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the Blue Book people, the judge that interviewed him, they all believe that Joe, and you can see Joe Symington, this crusty old guy, which I would want to be like one day, not too many years from now. He's on YouTube talking about this event, and there's no question that he experienced something, or at least really believes he experienced something.
Absolutely.
So, but how real, how physical, I don't really know. Emily, what do you think? You have to solve everything for us now to wrap it
up. Well, I mean, I think that it kind of brings back to something, Steve, I know that you and I talk a lot about, in that all of this paranormal activity, whether it's actual activity that's happening or something that's in our brains that makes it seem like it's activity that's happening, it's all related somehow. We may not know how, like the story you mentioned about, one person's alien is another person's fairy. And then with the sleep paralysis, the things that people see often correlate to things that either they're afraid of or that they're interested in, or maybe it was the last thing they saw before they went to bed, so it was fresh in their minds, and then that's what they see, even though the phenomena itself, feeling paralyzed and like you can't wake up or can't move, is the same, but the object or entity that appears is different, but it's all the same phenomena, right? It's just something different that shows up to different people.
Well, at one point, John Keel wasn't static in his thinking, but he thought that possibly the only thing that was objectively real about some of these experiences were, as he put it, those damnable meandering lights, and that people would see those, and then they would be programmed or would trigger something. And I remember him writing that he wasn't concerned about the manifestation, whether it was a UFO, a nuts and bolts craft, or a shambling hairy biped. It was he thought that was a facade, and he was interested in trying to determine what the cosmic mechanism, so to speak, was behind this
absolutely,
phenomenon.
absolutely. I totally agree with that entirely. But that's the thing. I've been over this discussion many times with people. My thinking personally is that, all these phenomena are masks covering up something else behind it. And whatever your belief system is what you then encounter. But there's a force behind it that doesn't have an identity of its own, doesn't have a form of its own. It just picks up what you're thinking about. There's a classic scene in Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, a TV show back in the 80s. I absolutely loved it. I loved it. It was okay, but there was one particular part that really struck me when there's a guy trying to set up the first Christian church on Mars, and one of the Martians kind of wanders in, and the priest turns around and sees Christ standing there, completely dripping blood from his hands. And basically, to cut a long story short, the alien Christ says, "You're basically seeing what you want me to appear to be. I can't control that. I'm just adhering to what you're thinking is. You're making me appear this way because it's what you believe in." And I thought, I really like that idea, because that would explain all the different kinds of apparently completely separate phenomena that underlie them. As John Keel was saying, there is something beneath that is almost universal.
Right. Well, you know what? We're getting close to the end of our time. I think I've been having so much fun tonight. I think that maybe we should have been licensed to have this much fun. But I've really enjoyed this. I hope you guys will do this again, because I didn't get to Emily and her weird experiences in the dreaded TNT area where the Mothman was seen. Andy, I wanted to talk to him about John Dee and his own personal music composition. And oh man, I've got a whole list here. But anyway, if we do this again, we'll have the continuing saga of the high strangeness factor. What do we call this? Roundtable. Yeah, that's it. Roundtable. I should look at my notes, I guess. Okay. Well, anyway, you guys get your plugs in, because we're running short on time. Emily, your website?
Oh, sure. atravelingspirit.com, and also on Instagram, atravelingspirit924 is the name.
What's your next event? What's the next time I'll see you guys? I wonder. Before the festival,
I hope so. We're actually going to be out of town most of the month of June. And I will at least. Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, California, and back.
I'm actually running an event for the in June 15th down in Point Pleasant. And Andy, plug all your good stuff.
Well, I finally got myself in gear and actually building a little website of myself. I've been told more than once I should have my own website. So excellent. I finally have, and you can find me at www. I forgot what it was. I went blank for a second there. A.D. Mercer. That's letter A, letter D, Mercer, mercer.co.uk. A.D. because that's just the name I write, and my esoteric writing is under A.D. because Andy sounds a bit kind of naff for an occult writer. But admercer.co.uk, and you can find a little website I'm in the process of putting together. I'm also on Facebook and can be found on there. And I've got Twitter, but I never use it. I don't use Instagram, so I'm not on those things. But the best way usually is to find me on Facebook. Anything connected with the Paranormal UK radio station, you can usually find me connected with that. Because I say, as you mentioned, I'm one of the show producers. I get a few of the shows to air. And I also have a YouTube page called Dark Mysterium, which is basically dark ambient music that I've mixed together. It's other people's music, it's not mine. I create continuous mixes. I try and do about one a month. Occasionally I throw in a few of my own tracks, but I just don't have time these days to sit down and really put stuff together. I'm spending most of my free time is either putting together shows for the UK Paranormal UK Radio Network or writing this fourth book, which is taking forever at the moment. I want to get it finished, but it's nearly there. So that's basically where you'll find me.
Well, Andy, you just need to retire like me. You won't have a lot of money, but you'll have a lot of fun.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to the idea of retiring in the not too distant future, I have to say.
Well, that's great. Okay, Emily Mittermaier and Andy Mercer, thank you for being on the High Strangeness Factor tonight, and thanks for making the roundtable a roaring success. If I don't say so, if I do say so myself, we'll expect those cards and letters coming in
Mhm.
saying how much everybody loved it. So now I will do my closeout, and like I say, we should do this actually again, not in the not too distant future, if you
Definitely,
guys are up for it.
definitely.
I would
Okay.
love that.
It's really, and I'll see about the licensing fee to make sure we're not, get arrested or anything. I also need to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, our fearless leaders here on the Paranormal UK radio network. I need to thank Andy Mercer a second time because he also wears a producer hat and takes good care of this show. A thank you to Brian Zeller, who composed the original music. Emily Mittermaier and I can also be heard from time to time as correspondents on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, which is also heard on this network. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Yank here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thank you for listening. I will see you all again in a fortnight. Take care.